So 10 o'clock, time to start. We've got three speakers today talking about retrofit talking about retrofit and conservation areas and planning and all these things that I don't know very much about. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Jonathan Ashe from Saffron Walden Community Energy, who's going to give the first presentation. And Brian, do message me with your question. Message me or my colleague Susie Tague with your question in the chat. Are you all right there, Jonathan, to start?
Yes, I am. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just get this sorted.
Okay. And do introduce yourself, because I think I've given you a bit of a rubbishy introduction.
No problem at all. I'll do that at the very start of it. 1 second. Let me just share my screen first of all.
Okay.
Share. Can we all see the screen?
Yep, we can see the screen.
That's great. Hi, my name is Jonathan Ashe. It's worth just stressing at the outset that this is an enormous subject that I can't possibly cover in its entirety within 15 minutes. So please appreciate I'll have to focus on aspects that I think will be most useful to the majority, but that they may not apply to all listed buildings and may contradict advice I'd give individuals on their own property. I'm a chartered architect specialising in listed buildings, plus I'm a certified passive house designer. That's why I've been asked to present on the subject of the difficulties in improving energy efficiency in listed buildings. Now, 1 second, I'm going to break the presentation down into a handful of subjects, which I'll run through as comprehensively as time allows. Firstly, we'll take a brief look at the differences between old and new buildings, modern traditional building methods. This will give us a good idea of some of the most difficult aspects of energy efficiency to reconcile for traditional buildings. We'll then touch briefly on historic England's guidance and approach to energy efficiency, the difficulties of getting a listed building consent for improvement works, and what actions you can do to give yourself the best chance when discussing with your local planning department. We'll look at a restoration project of a 300-year-old timber frame listed cottage in a conservation area, and all of the traditional methods used to improve energy efficiency to then allow modern green technologies to be added. We'll briefly look at a recent government white paper on the subject of adapting historic homes. Sorry, 1 second. Adapting historic homes for energy efficiency, a review of the barriers to give everyone a flavour of where this is heading. Lastly, I'm also a director of a voluntary organisation called Saffron Walden Community Energy, and we'll take a look at the collaborative work we're doing with our local authority in historic England to try to decarbonise an entire village. Energy efficiency is really underpinned by a fabric-first approach. That means we make the fabric of the building as energy efficient as possible before considering green technologies. This is particularly difficult in listed buildings, as you won't be allowed to alter or remove original or historic fabric. The main areas heat is lost from are the ground floor, the external walls, including windows and doors, and the roof. So we need to investigate carrying out work to improve these areas. These are where you will see the most improvement. To understand a bit about what works we should do, we really need to understand why. So here's a quick lesson. As I mentioned at the start, I'm a passive house designer, but what is passive house? It's what I'd probably describe as the gold standard of energy efficient design for new buildings. So in this example of the very latest modern techniques. It's worth very quickly explaining passive house principles to give you an idea of the level of detail required these days to build in the most energy efficient way possible. There are four main principles: form factor and orientation. The simpler the envelope, the exterior envelope of the building, and the bigger the volume contained in a small surface area, the more energy efficient the design will be from the start. The most energy efficient shape is a cube, and the more you deviate from that, the higher the form factor will be, which is essentially a number you multiply all other calculations by. So counterintuitively, a high-rise block of flats is a very efficient design since most of the flats don't have roofs or floors exposed to the outside air. In terms of orientation, we're looking for the majority of the glazing to be facing south, with minimal glazing facing north. That way you get solar gain from the south-facing windows and minimal heat loss from the north. Passive house principle 1 is the only relevant principle for traditional buildings. The next three principles are contrary to the traditional building methods and worth mentioning because of that. Insulation, the entire envelope is wrapped in a continuous unbroken layer of insulation, minimizing or completely avoiding cold bridges, which cause cold spots and heat loss. Airtightness, the building is constructed completely airtight to ensure no leakage of heat and humidity to outside air. And then lastly, number 4, MVHR, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. An airtight building traps moisture and stagnant air, so mechanical ventilation system helps resolve this by getting rid of the moisture whilst recovering up to 95% of heat from exhausted air. Just to assure you, this doesn't necessarily mean we will all be living in soulless cubes one day. Here are some examples of beautiful award-winning passive houses. As architects, it's our job to walk the fine line between energy efficiency and houses that are a joy to live in. This is a larch-clad house, award-winning house out in the countryside. It's got beautiful internal spaces. And we've got a curved house in Limerick. Again, strange shapes. We've got a building that's set into the hillside of an area of outstanding natural beauty, meaning that it just dissolves into the landscape, but gives beautiful views out of the countryside. And then we've got my personal favorite. This is an award-winning Norfolk example. It's a property developer site where they built to the local vernacular. And this is actually an award-winning development, is on the front cover of the recently published National Design Code as a shining example of the highest quality of design in the UK. So you can see that the way we build today has no resemblance to the way historic buildings are traditionally constructed. We hermetically seal the building to keep rain and cold out and help keep warmth in, but sealing the building traps moisture produced by our daily activities, and we then have to devise a way to get rid of it without also getting rid of the warmth. That means ventilation with heat recovery. Traditional building methods are based on the principles of breathability. They won't keep moisture out, but they also won't trap moisture in. We don't have time today to go into every wall construction in detail, so I'll talk predominantly about historic timber frame, especially since this is what I come across most in my daily work. The reason to mention this is that if you discover modern finishes to external walls, especially timber frame, you may be able to get consent to remove the finishes, insulate the walls with vapor permeable insulation, and reinstate breathable materials. If that's not possible, then for all intents and purposes, there's very little that can be done to improve the energy efficiency of your walls, which are the largest heat loss surface. Traditional lime-based plasters and renders are breathable, whereas modern cement-based renders unfortunately trap moisture. This also applies to modern plasticized paints versus breathable lime wash. Generally speaking, if your home is built before 1900, it should only ever be repointed, rendered, plastered, or painted with breathable lime products, including paints. Here's some examples of traditional breathable lime-based plaster and render, so we know what we're looking for. Lath and plaster here, and it's a lime-based plaster, which is obviously breathable itself. It's fairly common, fairly easy to spot. Wattle and daub, a little bit more uncommon. It's more interwoven sticks with rammed earth, horsehair, and whatever they can find, really. But also recognizing breathable finishes. It's really important as a first step to try to recognize where you might have traditional breathable finishes, as original fabric must not be removed. You can normally tell them by their bumpy, uneven finish, such as these photos from a 16th century timber frame house I recently advised a client on. Sometimes the finish looks a lot smoother, so the second way to test is to tap your knuckles against the finish. In timber frame finishes, if it sounds like a drum, then it's likely to be plasterboard, whereas if it's lath and plaster or wattle and daub, it'll feel almost malleable below your knuckles, as if it's giving way slightly. Recognizing modern finishes, some cement-based renders are very easy to spot, such as this example of an inappropriate pebble dash finish to a listed timber frame cottage. If it feels or sounds like plasterboard, or you can investigate and confirm it's a cement-based render, you may be able to gain listed building consent to insulate your walls. Modern plasterboards and render trap moisture in, so it's in the interest of the building for these to be removed and replaced with breathable lime plaster or render. With a timber frame building, this should give you the opportunity to insulate the frame with vapor permeable insulation before reinstating a more appropriate finish. I could easily do an entire 50-minute talk on windows and doors, so I'm going to keep it simple and just look at big, broad brush strokes. Generally speaking, at this moment in time, throughout most areas of the UK, you cannot replace original or historic windows in listed buildings unless they are beyond repair. In most cases, you are also not able to replace single glazing with double glazing, not even the heritage slimline double glazed units. There are exceptions to the rule, but they need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea are at the forefront of this right now, and Sarah Buckingham will talk to you after me about their approach, which we are currently working collaboratively to try to roll out across other areas of the UK. So with this in mind, we'll just look at secondary glazing for the moment. Secondary glazing is an excellent solution. It is far cheaper than replacing windows with double glazing and is generally supported by Historic England. It is incredibly energy efficient and also improves acoustics massively. So if you're able to install double glazed secondary glazing, it is for all intents and purposes like having triple glazed windows. There are two main types to consider: openable or removable. Openable remain in the window openings all year long, meaning you have to open both the secondary and original windows to let fresh air in. A lot of people want to avoid that. Removable can be simply removed in summer months and stored somewhere when they're not as effective. It is really important to understand that you currently cannot install secondary glazing in a listed building without consent from your local authority. There are no permitted development rights for listed buildings. Ground floors. Suspended timber floors can be insulated as long as you can get access to the entire subfloor void and you can maintain subfloor ventilation. This should already be evident in existing floors by air bricks back in front. The right-hand image on screen shows this. It is normally best to insulate with a flexible vapor-permeable insulation, which is normally mineral fibre, sheep's wool, etc., as this allows you to fit it around pipes, cables, etc., which will no doubt be in the way. For ground-bearing slabs, you must confirm if the structure was originally meant to be breathable. This is normal for a listed building. It is very common for original breathable lime slabs to have been removed and replaced with inappropriate concrete over the years. And if this is so, you have a good case for installing a modern, fully insulated limecrete slab, like the image on the bottom left here. We'll show you a case study of this in a later section. Loft spaces. Loft spaces are the easiest and cheapest improvement you can make to the energy efficiency of your house. The current recommendation is you install 300mm, 1 foot, of insulation. This will be a lot deeper than your joists and so has to be laid over them in an uninterrupted layer. You should get a professional to do this for you, as there are lots of issues that can arise if you don't know what you're doing, like blocking off ventilation to the loft space and health and safety issues from handling the insulation. There are still grants available and you should be able to carry this out without listed building consent. Roofs. Roofs are complicated, so you should seek professional advice before considering insulating roof slopes. For example, you can see from the image on screen that there is a lath and plaster finish to the underside of this listed roof. So insulating from below would not be allowed if you have to remove original fabric. Sloping ceilings in the upper floor of a house are the #1 area for heat loss, so it's definitely worth investigating. Moving on to Historic England. Historic England carried out a consultation on climate change and historic building adaptation that ended in December of last year. While there were some useful clarifications in there, for the most part, there were no meaningful changes to their views on energy efficiency measures to listed buildings. Most of us feel it's a real missed opportunity for them to properly engage with the public and tackle the looming issue of climate change head on. On a brighter note, though, they have published a wealth of guidance documents online that you can access and download for free. And there are some links on here that we'll issue later. I would highly recommend using the search facility on their website. You will no doubt find guidance on any listed building issue you can think of. Listed building consent and actions to take. The difficulties of listed building consent are why we're all attending this webinar. I no doubt don't have to explain how difficult it can be to you, but there are a couple of actions that I would recommend from the start. #1, carry out an in-depth planning research on your property, or better still, get a professional to do that for you. I can't stress enough how helpful this can be at an early stage in managing expectations and informing you about work that has been carried out previously. It's a difficult thing to do a comprehensive search by yourself. More often than not, applications or permissions are accidentally hidden away because the address was slightly different decades ago, or they used ROAD instead of RD in, say, Walden Road. If you're going to attempt it yourself, my recommendation is to use the map search facility on your planning department's website and keep going down every rabbit hole until the very end. I've turned this into a specific service for clients as I know how difficult it can be to find every single application. But when you do, you sometimes find absolute gems, like the listed 4-story Gothic villa I'm working on right now in London that had a 4-story rear extension built on the back, meaning there's almost no original fabric in the rear of the building. Or the local house from 1520 that I'm helping on as part of my voluntary work, where we discovered really detailed drawings from the 1970s showing that the floor slab was replaced in concrete and all of the wattle and daub was removed, giving us the opportunity to insulate all the external walls and floor. My other recommendation is to employ a heritage consultant at a very early stage. They'll be needed to produce a heritage statement that must accompany every listed building consent application, and they can provide very detailed background info long before you approach the planning authority. Restoration project, small confession, it's my own house, but that does mean we do have a wealth of information and progress photos to show you all what can be done. When I say it's a restoration project, I really do mean from the ground up. The house came with a report outlining £250,000 worth of repair work needing to be carried out before we even thought about improvements. But that meant we went in with our eyes open. It's a 300-year-old listed cottage on the far right here beyond the thatched barn. There was at least 4 or 5 small cottages at one time, as well as a bakery and the village shop. These are photos from about 1890. When we bought it, the previous owners had owned it for 50 years and done very little work to it. What they had done was detrimental to the place and had to be stripped out. So we had a bit of a blank canvas. We started by removing all the tiles to inspect and repair the roof. We then removed all of the pebbled ash render to inspect and repair the timber frame walls before insulating with sheep's wool and reinstating lath and lime render. We dug out the concrete floors and installed a breathable limecrete floor fully insulated to building reg standards with underfloor heating linked to an air source heat pump. We were then able to do all the nice bits, building a glass box boot room and the fully glazed garden room, and finishing the whole place off with a breathable lime finish. There we go. Adapting historic homes for energy efficiency, a review of the barriers. The government published this on the 3rd of January 2024, and it's extremely encouraging to see that they are recognising the very problems that all listed building owners are facing on a daily basis. This appears to be a call to action and a sign that things are going to change for the better in the coming years. It's 58 pages long, so I can't meaningfully talk about much of it now, but it recognises the work that Sarah Buckingham has done recently on consent orders and seems to be encouraging others to do the same. Sarah will explain more about this in a presentation after me. It's looking like very exciting times to come. Lastly, the Littleby Energy Project. The voluntary organisation Saffron Walden Community Energy that I'm a director of have been tasked with decarbonising the entire village of Littleby. That's roughly 240 houses, 110 of which are in a conservation area and 44 of which are listed. All homes, bar a handful, are either on oil-fired boilers or expensive electric heating, and we're currently investigating both bespoke solutions for every single property versus a district heating network like Swaffham Prior. We're working very closely with Uttersford District Council and Historic England to look at local listed building consent orders, which Sarah will talk about. We're offering advice to any resident and other community energy groups about what we're doing, and we're assisting every Littleby resident in looking at grant funding for improvements, air source heat pumps, solar panels, etc. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a very thorough presentation. There are some questions in the chat box. Personally, yes, I noticed somebody asked how much it cost. Oh God, we've got more people joining. What I suggest is that we do questions and answers at the end of the 3 presentations, because Jonathan's presentation is going to segue nicely into Sarah Buckingham's presentation. Now, Sarah works for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and before that, was it the Historic Homes England?
I've worked for Historic England for a while, yes,
Historic
well,
England.
for quite a long time actually, and yeah, among other things.
Well, and Sarah has done some radical things at Kensington, which I will hand over to Sarah to explain, which we hope will prompt you community energy people to go and talk to your councils about maybe duplicating it.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Liz, and good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here. The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings has kindly let me sit in their committee room, so I've got a meeting in here at 11, so I found a niche to hide in. And also thanks very much, thanks to Sarah Grimes, who's going to manage my presentation, because it wouldn't work when I was trying to do it. So yeah, so I'll make a start. Yeah, as Liz has mentioned, I work in Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, so a very urban place. So I'm coming from that perspective, but I think there are lessons there that are applicable more widely. And it's worth saying that, you know, as Jonathan's pointed out, if you have a listed building, it can be quite daunting, quite complicated to get the consent you need to make changes. And for some people, it's very off-putting. And we were finding that although we were granting consent for things like solar panels and other retrofitting improvements, there was a really strong sense among residents that actually it wasn't worth applying because they'd be told they couldn't do it. So our radical thing, which I'll go through in a minute, is about trying to make it actually literally make it easier for people, but also to overcome that perceptual barrier that you're not going to be allowed to do anything at all to your listed building, because that's far from true. And, you know, although listed buildings are a tiny proportion of the total built environment of the country, we seem to get an unfair sort of amount of flack for holding back progress. So I think it's, from my point of view, a slight sort of push against that idea as well. So sorry, if we could have that second slide, please. This is just some background stuff. I think you're probably all pretty familiar with this. You know, why are we so concerned right now? Well, you know, the effects of climate change are becoming more and more obvious on a daily basis, including today when there's sort of high winds and rains and goodness knows what else going on outside. And that's been coupled recently with, of course, this sort of absolutely huge rise in energy prices and people's real interest now in seeing if they can do things a bit more efficiently. Of course, it's not always that straightforward, but anyway, so there are incentives for the people who, you know, who own the buildings to make those changes. Next slide, Sarah, please. And I suppose certainly in the world of conservation, probably not for many of you, it's been something that's been a bit, you know, a bit of not a mystery, but people have been sort of uncertain about stepping out into this sort of slightly uncharted land, and you know, and to think about what they can do. I think within the heritage sector, familiarity is growing much more. We're getting more used to the idea and more comfortable, frankly, with the idea of saying yes to things, to changes. And as Jonathan's mentioned, Historic England have got reams of really helpful technical advice. So it's not simply grappling with the philosophy, it is actually saying, and here are some actual practical ideas. And that's all on their website. Next slide, please, Sarah. Yeah, I suppose, yeah, but also there's, you know, not only within the conservation world, but within the rest of the outside, you know, with the people who own the buildings who might be making the changes, sort of a need to help people understand what is and isn't possible. I think, yeah, I'll give the example of windows because it's a very easy win to think, oh, I know, I'll just change my windows and everything's going to be fine. And so we do get a lot of pressure for people to put double glazing in listed buildings. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it isn't. You know, we have to look at it on its own merits, but it's also helping people. I mean, many people, residents, for instance, haven't never heard of secondary glazing as an option. So, you know, there's something there to be sort of explored and developed. And I think on the right hand side, there's somebody who moved into, I thought it was actually an Elizabethan mansion, but in fact, on closer investigation, it turns out to be it's the Victorian replica, but who was outraged that he couldn't do everything he wanted to his grade 1 listed building. You know, it's what, you know, there is a balance to be found, so we have to help people find that balance. Next slide, please. Yeah, so going on about that, and you know, there are cheap and easy wins, and you know, I think there is the horror of the sprayed on expanding foam, which I think is being every time I turn on the internet there's an advert saying, why don't you do this? And it's, of course, it's irreversible, and I think even now it's beginning to have repercussions for people who are saying they can't sell their buildings or can't insure them properly because it's not really legit. So, you know, in a listed building, if you look on the right, there's somebody laying down some nice probably natural breathable insulation, that's fine. You know, if that's a cold roof space, that's not a problem. And there's a lot you can do in your listed building. Next slide, please. So as a local authority, and there are lots of things that a council can do to respond to climate change. We, like many other public bodies, declared the climate emergency and set out our action plan, which covers all of the aspects of it. We have issues with drainage, air quality, particularly because there are a lot of busy roads, biodiversity, all these things were all encompassed in there. Next slide, please. But in the planning department, we have actually done some things which are, taken things a step beyond that. We have a new local plan coming out. If you're not familiar with planning, particularly, it's where we set out our policies for how we will make decisions in the borough. That includes for listed buildings, although we're also guided by legislation and national policy. And we have very clear whole chapter about sustainability and a retrofitting policy, saying we are generally in favour of it. We have to balance it against other considerations, but we're not going to, there's not a no as a matter of principle anymore. It should be yes as a matter of principle if we can possibly say yes. We also produced a supplementary planning document which sets everything out in more detail. There's a lot in there about retrofitting, and I think that's been really helpful. It's been an exercise for us to go through to really focus our minds on what we want to say, and then on the right hand side, the householder guide, where we take elements of that and set them out in much more detail, including our traffic light table on the right, which gives people an indication of, just a high level indication, you're likely to be able to do this or maybe not. And I think what we're very clear about, and again, it's probably something that Jonathan sort of touched on, is about the whole house approach. It's not simply sticking on solutions, but actually starting from the beginning, thinking about the house and how it performs in energy terms, making sure it's properly maintained, because a damp or poorly maintained house is going to be less energy efficient. Looking at things like damp, which can also raise energy use because it's not as warm, before we get on to look at all the things you can do then to add to that, including, of course, finding more efficient and renewable sources of energy. So next slide, please. Just to say, the energy hierarchy the GLA has set out has been one of the things behind what we do. And you can see the inverted triangle where carbon offset, it may be a good thing, but it's perhaps the least desirable thing. What you should really be doing is use more renewable energy, use less energy, and use it in good clean sources of energy. Thank you. Next slide. So this is our radical response, and this was we've taken things just a step further than perhaps other councils have, and it's called a local listed building consent order. It was something that was introduced in legal reforms in 2013, in reforms to the listed building legislation. And what it is, it's a mechanism that allows a council to make its own local rules for what can be done in listed buildings. And it's effectively granting listed building consent for people to do works which could cover more than one building and is for a longer time scale, so up to 5 years, maybe 10 years. Maybe you don't put a time limit on it. So it's giving up local authorities the flexibility to look at what's special about their listed buildings, what works in their listed buildings, what's going to be acceptable, and to grant that in advance. So all people have to do is just comply with any conditions, and they can just get on with it. And this, the idea was to give people a much more a sense of our willingness to engage with retrofitting. So if you can see, there's some aerial photos, and it's been great having access to Google Earth as we do today, so you can actually see what's happening on everybody's roofs. A few surprises there, but, some unexpected roof terraces, possibly even, I'm waiting to find a swimming pool up there. I know somebody will have one. But, you can see these big complex roof structures. There's got to be, in many of them, there's got to be a south-facing roof slope somewhere. Also, the houses, many of them are so tall you can't see the roofs from the street. So, having surveyed most of our listed buildings, we decided that we could make an order that would allow people to put solar panels on their listed buildings, with under certain provisos, which meant they weren't going to be particularly obtrusive. And if you look on the right, there are actually a couple of our highly graded listed buildings. They're 2-star listed buildings, so slightly exceptional. And they've already got solar panels on them. I have to say they may not necessarily have listed building consent for those, but the point is, I suppose, that I didn't know they were there until I started looking on satellite images. So it can be done. Right, next slide, please. So yes, we decided to go big. So we said we'll cover the whole borough, all of our grade 2 buildings, and the grade 2 stars, they're more sensitive, but we went through them all and had checked everyone individually and worked out which ones we could safely include and which not. We didn't include grade 1 buildings. We didn't want that kind of fight, but maybe another time. We didn't include churches because we don't control what happens to listed churches. That's a separate system run by the various church bodies. But yeah, so we tried to throw the order as widely as we could. Next slide, please. So we allow solar panels, but also other forms of solar equipment and solar slates, because the technology there is getting better. So we think, yeah, that there is scope for those, and the visual impacts are largely the same of solar thermal, but solar slates are possibly not much less visible. Next slide, please. Yes, but it's important to say that there are things called, that's the one. Oh no, it's the one before. If you can, I think that's right. No, next one. Yes, that's it. That's the one. Sorry, I wasn't reading it properly. Yeah, so there are things called permitted development rights, which I think, again, Jonathan mentioned earlier, which are things that you can do to your building without planning permission. Interestingly, there are, Jonathan, you said that listed buildings don't have permitted development rights. Generally, they don't, but they're in some cases, for some reason, they do. So solar panels are actually allowed on listed buildings under certain circumstances, under the regulations, for whatever reason, and I don't know what that is. So if in our order we've just replicated the conditions on the general permitted development order, which means that you don't need list planning permission, and also you don't need listed building consent. Sorry, it's a really abstruse planning point, but the point of it was that we wouldn't. So to make it perfectly straightforward for people, so not the taking away one consent but leaving planning permission, but giving them the opportunity to just do it, providing they followed the conditions. The main thing about what you can't do is put a panel on a roof slope fronting a highway, because obviously there is potential perhaps for visual impacts there. But we also added our own condition. There's condition, another condition that we, if your panels are redundant, you take them away, which is just, again, that's normal, good practice. So next slide, please. But we put our own conditions. So what it means is that people just have to come back to us and check in through a much simpler system, just to say, well, I want X number of panels, I want to put them here, and I want them to be this color, normally gray, but things are changing there, and we can just say, yes, that's fine, or could you move them up, or could you group them more, in a more sort of neater way. And what we're very insistent on is, another thing, is that they have the frames of the panels are not shiny metal, that they have them painted to blend in, so you get these neat, very discreet little sort of groups of solar panels, which are not particularly obtrusive. Next slide, please. Yes, we went through a full public consultation. Suffice it to say, historically, England wasn't entirely enthusiastic, but in the end, the legislation says it's our call, and as long as we've met the regulations, that we're fine. There were historic owners bodies, like the Historic Houses Association, who for some reason were interested in this and were very supportive, and other organisations were supportive. Next slide, please. Yes, we've had lots of inquiries. We've got a few approvals have happened, and others are in the pipeline. If you can look on the left-hand side, there is you can see in sort of around the centre there is a sort of a solar array, as we call it, that was put in a roof that was being refurbished anyway. And you know, I think that's pretty discreet. It's on the rear of the building. Yes, you can see it, but it doesn't really cry out for attention. And it's basically the kind of thing we'd have granted listed building consent for anyway. But you know, we've encouraged people to do that. There's a small picture there of the front of the house at the bottom, and you can see that that's really the business end of what's special and interesting about the house, and that's not at all affected by having a solar panel on the back. Next slide, please. Yes, what we've also now added was a local listed building consent for window works. And again, touching on something Jonathan said, we allow secondary glazing. That's something that Historic England is very supportive of, and it is a good way of getting around the problem of historic or sensitive windows. In this one, we haven't got any conditions. We've simply been incredibly specific about what you can or can't do. So it's all out there. As long as you comply with those requirements, then you'll be fine. We've also allowed double glazing in certain circumstances, which is where the windows have already been replaced. So you're not dealing with original windows. And I think that's only fair. It doesn't seem right to say that people who live in this building can't have any double glazing if it's not affecting any original fabric or the character of the building. We are pretty precise about how slimline that glazing is, and pretty precise about design details. So we don't want to see big trickle vents. We don't want to see stuck-on glazing bars. So we want them to be well designed. You know, in Kensington, I think we can be that picky. Yeah. So, but we do want to retain historic fabric, particularly original windows, but also original historic glass, which is an unusual survival. Zoom has disappeared. Sorry. Next slide, please. So looking forward, I mean, we're trying to make more residents aware of the various orders and help them with their own retrofitting plans. So, you know, we have now a web page which has got all this information on it. But I think, you know, again, following on from what Jonathan said, we really want to encourage people to look at planning these works properly, looking at the whole building, as well as just the was just things they can add to it. But think about maintenance, think about managing its breathability as well. Annual monitoring. I think we have spoken to a lot of other local authorities now, and I think the important thing about listed building consent orders that I'd mention is that there's not a one size fits all measure. You can do what works for your borough or your place, and that's why the work I've been doing with Uttlesford and with Jonathan is also important, because you can see how you just do it in a different way. You can make it work in a very different scenario, in a rural scenario, and I think that can happen. So I'm really glad that they're willing to pilot that. As Jonathan mentioned, there's been recent changes. The government sort of white paper is a recent change, and the Levelling Up department did come and speak to me, and they clearly see this as an important way of doing things, or it has potential. Permitted development rights have recently changed to allow solar panels on flat roofs, although to be frank, I didn't see that they weren't permitted, because you know, a flat roof has got a slope, but it's just a really shallow one. And what else? So we were also writing a new piece of supplementary planning advice going into a lot of detail about window work, so people can really get to grips with doing things to windows. And I think that's going to be a really useful source of information for residents. What next? Well, we've been asked to look into air source heat pumps. That's slightly different, but you know, something that may be coming up soon. So that's all I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hang a minute. Sorry, I'm doing 2 or 3 things in one day. It's still not working. Yeah, thank you. That was very thorough. I feel I understand a little bit more now about about consent orders and how you can set things up to make it easier for people within local authorities to actually take the action we'd like them to see. So thank you. I'd love to see that repeated in other places. And I encourage people to put any questions they may have about that process, or how you might be able to get that process going in your local authority, do please stick them in the chat box, and we will have some questions after our last presentation, because Sarah's presentation segues nicely into the presentation from Bath, I'm going to just say, which is Sarah Grimes and Alex Best, one of whom works in the community energy group in Bath, and Alex works for the local authority, and they are running a project which supports listed building owners to navigate the best way to retrofit their homes within the current restraints in legislation. And I think it's a really exciting project, actually, which is that they'll be able to share details of. They're at the beginning of the project now. I'll hand over to you two to talk more thoroughly and knowledgeably than I. And you must remember to unmute yourselves. And at the moment we can see your, oh, there we are.
Here we go. Can everyone see? Lovely. I'll hand over to Sarah to start.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, it's great to be speaking to you today. Thanks for inviting us, despite us being from the west of the country. So yeah, I'm Sarah Grimes. I'm Head of Community Business Development at Bath and West Community Energy, and I've formerly worked for quite a long time at Bath and North East Somerset Council, including on planning and listed buildings. Alexandra is my colleague, Alex Best. She's a conservation officer at Bath and North East Somerset Council, and we're working together on this project. So if we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So really want to talk to you today about our Green Heritage Homes project. So this is funded through the Local Energy Advice Demonstrator Programme, which is funding from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and it's administered by the Southwest Net Zero Hub. And it's all about, the funding is really to help evolve advice for people who live either in hard to treat homes or are hard to reach. And so we're very much focusing on hard to treat homes, in particular listed buildings, because they have the additional step to take of getting listed building consent. And our project really focuses on, I suppose, the fact that in many ways, conservation professionals and energy professionals speak sort of different languages slightly. So there's a real body of expertise that both have. And so the aim of this project really is to fuse more conservation advice into energy advice, and fuse more energy advice into conservation advice. So have a bit more of a mingling of those disciplines to produce a really well-rounded advice for homeowners, and result in more positive views of amongst residents as well, about the fact that yes, you can. There's a lot, as we've just been discussing, there's actually a lot you can do to make listed buildings more energy efficient. And so we're doing that in several ways, which we'll go through as I'll hand over to Alex to describe more about some of those. But I will say first of all that the only way to really approach this project was as a partnership. So we've got a partnership of Bath and West Community Energy, we've got Bath and North East Somerset Council, obviously, Bath Preservation Trust, which is a really well-regarded heritage advocacy group in Bath, the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and people-powered retrofit as well. And so there's a really nice mix of kind of conservation and energy professionals, all really geared towards this idea that you can conserve a building's heritage and make it more energy efficient and have lots of win-wins. So we're doing this through several routes. So listed building champions, which Alex will talk about, is really about peer advocacy. So it's about giving people a really good service of energy advice and conservation advice, and then enabling them to have a positive experience that they can then go and share. So bad news travels fast. We know that when someone gets a no on listed building consent, you often hear about that. Well, we want to do the opposite and say, there actually is some really good stuff happening. As we've heard from Sarah, and her amazing work, practice is changing, and people need to understand that. It's also about creating a new level of listed building consent advice, which is the level 0 pre-app, which Alex again will talk about. And then really looking beyond that, developing this sort of shared body of knowledge between conservation and energy, which will result in incorporation of more listed building advice into energy assessment tools. So working with people-powered retrofits, home energy planner tool, which is locally called Future-Proof, and other retrofit assessments. And then alongside having energy assessments be more cognizant of conservation requirements, also gives us an opportunity to address embodied carbon, because that's really closely aligned to conservation, in that a lot of the times the materials that are more appropriate for conservation, so breathable materials, natural materials that were originally used in these buildings, are also a lot lower embodied carbon. And I think as time goes on and operational carbon starts to drop through decarbonisation of the grid, embodied carbon will become increasingly important. So we want to be able to provide some guidance on embodied carbon of materials too. Locally, we're going to be doing a lot. So we're going to have small group spotlight sessions where people will be getting in Bath and North East Somerset, will be able to go in groups of about 6 to get advice from both conservation officer and an energy professional at the same time. We're also developing some training modules, and those we'll be developing them both as in live trainings, which you're very welcome to attend, which will be one on conservation principles of significance. So for retrofit, how would you approach assessing the significance of your building? So getting that kind of conservation lens on the building to assess what might be suitable. And then Alex is developing one on the listed consent process itself. So looking at what's proportional, what needs to be submitted for different types of applications and how to go about the process, and that it's very doable. We are also going to be presenting to local and national networks such as we are today. So lastly, is we're looking at landlords. So a lot of landlords of listed buildings feel like they're exempt from the minimum energy efficiency standards, MEES regulations of getting an EPCE. And we need to get the message across that actually they aren't just default exempt from those regulations. They need to demonstrate, if they are going to claim an exemption, they need to demonstrate that they've had advice from a conservation officer that the measures that would be required to bring them up to an E, which still isn't brilliant, but it's something, and we have a lot of F and G listed buildings out there. The measures wouldn't get consent. Now practice is starting to change, and we are consenting more things like windows. There might be a possibility that these landlords actually can't claim that exemption. So listed building tenants are some of the, especially in Bath, we have lots of cases of fuel poverty, for example. So we think it's really important to engage landlords, and a lot of landlords are really very willing, once they realise this, to actually improve the buildings. So that's a little bit about the project. Now Alex is going to dive more into some of what we're actually doing.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. What's this going to go through? So yeah, so hi, as I've already been introduced, my name's Alex, and I'm one of the conservation officers working at Baines Council. I was brought in recently, several months ago, to work specifically on the Green Heritage Homes project, which we sort of started picking up in greater speed last year. So we've had some really exciting progress in terms of working with local residents and getting the framework set up to carry this project through over the next 18 months or so, and also sort of looking at the long term of the project as well, and what sort of strategies can be embedded in the council going forwards. So to give a little bit of context of where we're coming from as a local authority, so in 2019, Baines Council declared its climate and ecological emergencies, and it also then published its climate emergency strategy, looking from 2019 forward to 2035 to identify the key priorities across the district in terms of motivating climate action. And at the top of the list of key priorities is decarbonising our existing buildings, along with decarbonising transport, increasing renewable energy generation, and also cutting the council's operational carbon to net zero by 2030. And I've just included a quick emissions breakdown here, which I think really accurately summarises sort of the particular prominence of buildings at the forefront of the climate emergency, where over half, so 66% of our buildings across the district are responsible for local emissions, and in particular there is a focus on domestic buildings as well, so that's 38%. So I think that really sort of showcases the real drive to be making our homes more energy efficient as sort of the key action that we should be taking forwards. Excuse me. I've also included this table here, which sort of illustrates the direct correlation between increases in income in local households, and also the increase in CO2 emissions produced, and that's sort of broken down into different types of fuel consumption. But what you can see here, if we're looking at the green bar at the bottom, is there's a really consistent percentage of CO2 emissions that are driven by household fuels. So again, really highlighting that there is a shared issue across households from all incomes and all backgrounds in terms of inefficient homes and fuel use and heat loss. And that varies from around 42% of total income from highest income backgrounds to a really staggering 72% fuel emissions across low income households. So it really indicates that this is a district-wide issue. And as part of the climate emergency strategy that we've published, we've really gone into highlighting the benefits that retrofit can provide. So that varies from addressing fuel poverty, improving health for vulnerable residents, reducing energy consumption and wasted heat, and making our buildings more comfortable. And there's a whole parcel of economic benefits that come with that as well. But what's worth flagging is that we have specifically raised the issue of how we address heritage buildings, and particularly listed buildings, where upgrades to improve energy efficiency in heritage buildings and in conservation areas must be done sensitively. So there's a real focus in terms of considering what needs to be protected across the district, and how that then factors into retrofit projects. Whilst we're looking at retrofit, it is also worth looking at sort of the rates of listed building consent and sort of dispelling some of the misconceptions that can come with the listed building consent process. So often we do come across this perception that, you know, it's really hard to get listed building consent, you can't do anything with a listed building, and none of those changes are going to be allowed. Whereas in fact, the existing rates for listed building consent are really quite high. So Historic England published the results of a 2017 survey in its overall 2022 publication survey of listed building owners and occupiers, and it surveyed over 1,600 residents. And from that, it found that there was a 75% consent rate in listed building applications submitted. So, you know, over 3/4 or around 3/4 of applications were securing consent. And locally within Bath and North East Somerset, we have an even higher percentage rate. So from between 2022 and 2023, we had a listed building consent approval rate of 95%. So that's 370 applications granted consent out of 391. So again, it's a really high number, and I don't think it necessarily gets the attention that it would otherwise. And there's a real focus on the negatives and the few applications that might be refused for whatever reason. Just feeding back on the Historic England survey as well, which also provides some really useful statistics in terms of perceived retrofit barriers as well by listed building owners. So it shows a really high percentage of listed building owners are concerned about the climate emergency. So 90% of listed building owners are concerned about climate change, and around a third find it difficult to stay warm in the winter, or experience difficulties with damp and mold. So, you know, they've got really specific issues with their buildings already. But what we have seen nationally is that, you know, around half of those surveyed, so around 45% to 51%, consider that there are a high number of barriers around retrofit, whether that be cost, lack of funding, finding the right professionals, or just even understanding where to start or understanding the process. So it's these sorts of issues that we're hoping to dispel and hoping to provide some light on through the Green Heritage Homes project. So I'm just gonna sort of summarise what we're hoping to do as part of the project. So we're looking at two key strands, as Sarah summarised earlier, so the Level 0 pre-app and listed building champions. So we'll have a look at the Level 0 pre-app first. So this is due to be released through Baines Council. So this is intended as a new pre-app service for the retrofit of listed buildings. So at the moment, you can apply for a pre-app if you're looking at works to a listed building. It's a service that's offered before you submit a listed building application, and it gives you the opportunity to engage with the conservation officer, maybe includes a site visit, and if there are any potential issues or problems with an application, or any further information that's required, that can then be raised ahead of the submission of an application. And so a pre-app is basically intended to streamline that planning process for an applicant. But what we found is that generally going into a pre-app, you will require certain levels of information. So potentially floor plans, elevations, you'll need an idea of what works you want to be submitting. And so the intention of the level 0, which we're now proposing here, is that this is going to be as early in the process as possible. It's aimed at listed building owners or occupiers who don't know where to start. They might want to make their home more energy efficient, but they don't know what they can do. And they have that opportunity to then come at that very early process to speak with a conservation officer who has an understanding of the technical and conservation implications of retrofit. And we can then have that really open discussion about what opportunities might be available. So this service will include working with the Baines Council Conservation Officer. So in this case, it's myself, including a site visit, a real good sort of assessment of the building in terms of what opportunities are available, whether there are any restrictions that potentially certain works might not work as efficiently with. And then an applicant will be issued with a pre-app report that will really break down that discussion into clear detail and give you a really good idea of where you can take a retrofit project next. And that is then informed for you to take through to a listed building application. And we're intending to offer this at a really accessible cost as well. So at the moment, our initial, our existing level 1 pre-app, which is the sort of the starting pre-app at the moment, that cost is offered at £141. So the level 0 pre-app would be opening that up even more at a lower cost of £66. So we really want to be able to engage with as many people as possible, as early as possible. And we hope that will be then reflected. And we are at the moment piloting the pre-app in partnership with Bath and West Community Energy as part of the work we're doing with the listed building energy champions, which I'll go into a bit more detail about on the next slide. And I've just given an indication, as at the start of the project, we're sort of looking forward and trying to see sort of how many people we can reach and what sort of targets we can be meeting. So again, we've got a rough idea of 30 level 0 pre-apps being processed by March 2025, but we anticipate that number could be a lot higher, where we've already seen that there is quite a lot of interest and appetite from homeowners. And then so the second half of the project that we're also working on at the moment is we're looking at basically recruiting listed building energy champions. So these are listed building owners who are looking to retrofit their homes, but they're looking to be a really active and central part of this project in terms of what they can gain from the project, but also what they can give back to us. So the benefits of the project is that you get a full future-proof home energy survey. So that's offered by Bath and West Community Energy from their retrofit coordinator. And as part of that, you would also be receiving a level 0 pre-app from the Baines Conservation Officer. So you're getting a really dual survey offer from both the conservation perspective, but also from a technical perspective in terms of assessing what measures would be most effective, where the cost savings would be, areas of heat loss, for instance. So it's a really sort of valuable package. And in exchange for that, we'd be asking for the energy champions to be working a lot closer with us. So offering sort of a published case study so we can have really good examples of thorough retrofit in listed buildings, as well as the opportunity for ongoing monitoring, feedback surveys to really sort of tailor our service. We do also have the offer of becoming a super champion as well, which requires a lot more involvement, so potentially opening up their homes for visits from other residents or homeowners who are interested in doing similar works, participation in surgeries and talks. So it's really exciting to have the opportunity to work so closely with listed building homeowners. And again, we're at the start of the process. I think we've done 3 listed building energy champion site visits so far. We've got another 3 to 4 lined up over the coming weeks. So they're really coming in thick and fast. And we've had some really great feedback so far on site where residents have just been really excited to see what they can do and see what advice we can offer them. So it's been a really, really good start. And over the course of the project, we're aiming to have 50 listed building energy champions brought together. So it's going to be a really sort of exciting and wide-ranging network across a lot of different building types. And for the last slide, I'll hand back over to Sarah to just give an idea of what's coming up and what to watch out for.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, so a lot of this is taking place, of course, in Bath and North East Somerset, since that's the council that we're working with. Very glad to be working with them. But there will be some resources that will be available for national, we would hope would be used nationally. So as mentioned, we will be working sort of mid to late spring. We'll have these available, which are either input, live, online, or the recordings of 2 trainings which are being developed. And really, part of this is just to demystify a little bit what conservation is. So I think the perception often is, oh, it's just about how it looks. Actually, with a listed building, a lot of it's about the fabric and how it looks as the buildings look as a group, and what the craftsmanship was that tells the story of that building. And I think personally, as an energy professional, I've gotten really quite to get onto it. Oh, I think we need to meet somebody there. Yeah, thank you. As an energy professional, it's just been fascinating for me to actually learn about some of this conservation, and just, I'm a Bath native, and actually learning about these buildings and learning about how they were made, and learning about actually now how we are moving back towards a lot of the techniques that those amazing Georgian and pre-Georgian sort of innovators had to make their buildings warm. We're moving back to some of those now. That's just been a real learning, and I think for listed building owners, and knowing that what the information you need to really assess the significance of your building is publicly available, as Jonathan was describing, and you can really learn about the story of your building. It's actually quite exciting, that part of it. So there'll be a training on that. Also, as Alex will be really going through step by step how you get listed building consent. So if you're new to the idea of getting consent, then this will just step you through it. We're going around to some of our champions in the area to be getting video case studies of the measures that have been consented, and so that'll be these little vignettes. We'll be talking through, okay, this is why we consented this particular measure in this particular case. So again, it helps you build that picture of what's likely to be acceptable for both energy and conservation. Also look out for embodied carbon retrofit guidance, and hopefully, yes, we'd love it if more councils started to offer this level 0 pre-application advice, because I think it's just so much, it's really positive, getting in there before people have gotten fixed on what they want to do. Oftentimes, even at pre-app, like Alex was saying, people come in saying, I want this kind of window, and then when they get a no, it's just like, oh, I've got there, oh no, gutted. Whereas actually, a conservation officer could quite early on be like, oh, well, maybe that wouldn't work, but this is just as good and this would work. And seeing what Alex has been doing out there in the field is exactly that. So yeah, that's what we're hoping for really out of this project. I think that's it from us.
Thank you so much, both of you. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. In fact, I thought the whole range of presentations was, well, it was a very varied range. I understood the Bath and your project the best myself, because I've got my community energy background more than planning background. But I do hope that the talks about planning and how they've managed things in Kensington and Chelsea have been helpful to you. I'm going to hand over to Ollie, our CEO now, who is going to manage all the questions.
Thanks very much, Liz. Well, hopefully with Liz's help. Thanks to all the speakers, Jonathan up in Littlebury and with Saffron Walden Community Energy and your expertise as an architect, and the team from Kensington and Chelsea, from Bath and West. This is happening across the country. Our vision at Community Energy South is to support communities, particularly in rural areas, to have clusters and around energy advice and energy champion work to support their communities. And it's very localized around districts and boroughs, as you all know, and linking up with the conservation officers and the councils and making that link. So, and we see that across the country. I see that Besco are here, Tim from Besco, you've been doing this in Brighton for a long time, and lots of other champions around the country. So it's really a momentum. So I do urge you to get in touch if you're not supported with an energy champion network, and to look at this from a community level, and share this expertise across, you know, in streets and communities, and that's at the heart of community energy. And I expect as over the next couple of years, as our political landscape might change, there will be a lot more support in this, and I hope this, and there's lots of examples coming through, and so it's great to see. So let's move on to the question and answer.
First question, James Taylor.
So first question from James Taylor, who's from Suffolk, I believe, James.
If it's me, it's James Taylor from Essex. I just had
yes, from Essex. Yeah, but Malden, of course.
yeah. Yeah, I just had there was something that arose about things you can do that are visible from the highway. And I've had some questions about this, because about what actually constitutes a highway when people say this. Around me, we have bits of land which are used, which are owned privately. They might be managed by Essex Highways, but not owned by them. Does that constitute a highway? Does a footpath constitute a highway? Yeah, it was just about that, really.
That's a difficult one to answer. I mean, a footpath isn't the highway. I can say that with some conviction, but you know, I think a private road isn't essentially a highway. I think I mean, generally, I mean, obviously in London, they're pretty straightforward to identify. They've got pavements and cars. Obviously it's there will be a legal definition, but I don't know what it is at this point, I'm afraid.
Maybe Jonathan, you've got an angle on that, coming from a village. You're on mute, Jonathan.
I don't, unfortunately. I think Sarah and I have briefly spoken about this before, what constitutes a highway. We have, I have somebody, I won't name names, in our village who has installed solar panels that face what doesn't appear to be a highway. It's certainly a small, not private road, public road. But the consensus seems to be that, I think, I mean, Sarah might correct me here,
It's
but
a public road, I think, looking. Yeah, I think it's a public road.
Public road, is it? Okay,
point.
there you go.
Yeah.
So,
an area of land which the public at large have the absolute right to use to pass and repass without let or hindrance.
Okay.
Technically speaking. So private roads, footpaths, clearly not quite the same.
Sarah, can I just quickly jump in on that a second? So you'd said earlier on about solar panels and development rights. So I take my advice from the planning portal, and on the planning portal under solar panels and permitted development rights, it says it's on a list of building. So it is confusing.
If you, I think it's a misconception. If you actually read the general permitted development order, it doesn't mention listed buildings as not having that permitted development right. It's written in different ways for different parts, and I think the assumption was probably made that, well, there's listed building consent, we don't need to say no because it's already controlled by a different regime.
So funnily enough, the planning portal says the panels must not be installed on a building that's within the grounds of the listed building. Yeah,
within the grounds of a listed building. That's for some reason curtilage buildings don't have permitted development rights. So it does specifically mention curtilage buildings in the grounds of the curtilage listed building. So don't ask me why. That's what we're dealing with. Maybe it's something the government would look to reform as part of the white paper. Who knows?
Let's hope so. So I'm going to move on to Cara Naden. Did I say your surname correctly, Cara? You had a question that we picked up from the chat.
Okay, well, if she's not here, there was also Danny Lee had about 75 questions. So Danny, we'd love to hear one or two of your questions. There were some really good questions. I can't remember what they all were now. So
yeah, thank you. I suppose mine is sort of all encompassing. I mean, I have some real concerns about, not because we're not doing good stuff, and I'm fully on board, and I really think there's some fantastic work being done. I like the commingling comments made by, was it Sarah, etc. But it's this whole approach to retrofit and new build. We talked about whole life carbon, we've mentioned embodied energy, and we know that sort of budget of operational carbon treatment means that embodied energy carbon is becoming a higher issue, a higher concern. But is this wider supply chain impact on the environment, from continued use of unsustainable resource-heavy techniques, non-natural materials, and so on. And it was mentioned that there's fantastic natural-based products out there. But not once have we mentioned environmental product declarations in this seminar for products and materials. And I did see one slide about the best life cycle cradle-to-cradle credentials, but that generally is scant, and that's rather concerning. So really, the question is, professionals and non-professionals are really up against it to navigate this maze to select the best nature, climate crisis mitigating approaches and products and so on for a myriad type of buildings and locations. So is there from the experts, can they point to a best practice hub or somewhere to help the uninitiated to navigate through this? Because it is really difficult if you want to do the right thing for the crises that we're now encountering. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. That's a great question.
So I'll just quickly jump in. I'm just doing a quick search here to see if I can see anything particularly easy. The AECB, the Association for Environmentally Conscious Buildings, would be a good place to start. There's also something called a green building. I can't remember exactly what it's called. But there is another organization called as well. Shamefully, Passive House don't actually care really about how environmentally friendly products are. They're only concerned with the energy efficiency of a building, and they will tell you outright that the nastiest insulations are the best insulations, or the best insulators, not necessarily the ones we would always use. It tends to be that a Passive House, for example, are all built from sustainable timber products using recycled paper insulation, but that's specifically because we can get it into every nook and cranny in the construction of walls, etc. So that's not anything to do with actually how environmentally friendly it is, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'll just add is if anybody's got any other comments on that, do put your hands up. My observation locally in the villages where I work as an energy champion is that we do an annual village energy fair, and we invite local suppliers in, and some really interesting local suppliers have come through that, where they use local materials, reuse materials, and nature-based paints. And I see them thriving because we've introduced them to the community, and they're starting to work with the community with that. So it can become very localized. So try and encourage that as much as possible.
I just quickly found a green building store would be another one, a good one to look at. But you'll just have to do a bit of a search yourself. Really, there is no hub for this sort of thing, unfortunately.
I think you've made my point. There is not a
yes, absolutely
easy, navigable way to find out how to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
There's also the Green Growth Platform, which is a university-based collaborative across the country. It may be worth tapping into them. It's called Green Growth, and I think they've got 3,500 business suppliers on their network around sustainability and this agenda. And
there's Association of Sustainable Product, ASBP, I think it's called, which also has a product list. But again, it's not complete, but I'll highlight that as an opportunity.
Thanks, Danny.
Perfect.
Thanks, Danny. Always amazing to have you along on a journey, and thanks for everything that WINAC do and you're doing in Winchester. Hannah Cates came up with a question. Are you there, Hannah?
Hi, yeah. It has been answered in the chat. I was asking Sarah and Alex if they could talk a little bit more about their future-proof surveys. I think there has been some follow-up questions from someone else about whether this takes into account a listed house. So perhaps Alex or Sarah could talk a little bit more about that.
Sarah or Alex?
Yeah, I think Alex, both of us maybe have an answer to this, but well, at the moment, retrofit assessments generally don't. I think that's because that is because there's a specialist energy knowledge, and then there's specialist conservation knowledge, and there's much more, through past 2035 and through the new thinking in retrofit, there's much more awareness of things like breathable materials and the appropriateness or otherwise of different things you can do to traditional buildings. But then for listed buildings, you have that extra lens you need to add, which is significance. You know, what is the significance of that building? Why has it been listed? And that covers a lot more dimensions than just the technical aspect of how to safely retrofit a traditional building. And so generally, because the historic stock, I mean, there is, I think, about 500,000 listed buildings throughout the country. So you think about that, it's bigger than the city of Bristol or a large city. So it's we need to tackle this. But for any one area, it's usually a relatively small part of a retrofit coordinator's job, looking at listed buildings. So what we tend to see, I think Jonathan's had similar experiences, is that this kind of conservation lens isn't generally as honed perhaps as it could be when dealing with listed buildings. So that's really what the project is seeking to do, is saying, okay, you know, starting maybe working with people powered retrofit, who are the owners of the methodology behind the future-proof surveys, you know, how can we make it so that when an assessor is in a listed building and they're kind of coming up with options for the retrofit plan or the retrofit coordinator, there are ways that they can easily access, okay, and for this you probably will need to look for consent, or for this, these are the, you know, just very quickly kind of the considerations you might need to look at in terms of choosing the type of window. You know, the information's all out there, and actually I'll post a link to the there's others, amazing guidance from other councils, but Bath and North East Somerset Council does have a really strong supplementary planning document, which has just very accessible kind of, here are the do's and don'ts with particular measures. So it's just like finding a form of that can be incorporated in retrofit assessments, future-proof, but then also others. So, you know, what can be off the shelf so that any retrofit coordinator can kind of easily pick that up and add that in if they are going to a listed building. I think that's the aim. I mean, I don't know if you've got any reflections on that, Alex, as well. So you've obviously been going out with a retrofit coordinator, haven't you, to visit these listed buildings?
If I can also just quickly jump in on that. I think I'm right in saying that, so I started the course for, I've done some of the qualifications towards a retrofit coordinator, retrofit assessor. I ended up dropping out of this far more valuable work to do with Sarah and on things, some other stuff there. But I think I'm right in saying that in 2024, 2025, all DEAs and retrofit assessors and coordinators will have to have the traditional building qualification. I think that's right. But there are definitely some out there. I just put on the chat about, might be in a private chat, but about somebody, the very first one I looked at privately for somebody, was somebody very experienced in listed buildings.
Yeah, I suppose I'm happy to just sort of jump in and add, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think we do have one of our retrofit coordinators on the line as well. But generally the way that the future-proof survey works is from a much more technical perspective in terms of the characteristics of the building fabric itself. So looking at things like the U values of walls and floors and roofs, and how those can potentially be modeled to be more efficient using, you know, if we're looking at certain types of insulation, certain depths of insulation, what would happen if we put insulation on this wall, or if we couldn't have it on that wall? So it's very much, the future-proof survey is very much looking at what options there are available in terms of that energy saving. Where that then comes into the project and sort of meeting halfway with the conservation officer is that calculation, it struggles to take into account the more sort of slightly subjective assessment of things less tangible to do with a listed building, in terms of what areas of fabric are significant and why they're significant. So what we're hoping to do through the project is basically informing what that modelling is looking like by having that discussion about what can and can't be done, or what opportunities there might be, so then that assessment of significance can be taken into account when we're looking at those different models, and then what's being fed back to the applicant. So it's very much sort of trying to balance the sort of human side of it with the sort of the calculations that are coming out of the computer. I think that's correct, but that's, yeah, it's an interesting finding in terms of how we're negotiating that.
Did I just say, and coming at it from the other side, from the conservation officer's side, what we've tried to do is to give my team as much training as possible. I know we're quite lucky because we've been able to do that, just so they have the confidence to have those conversations. And in a way, it feels like we need to meet in the middle, don't we? Because we're never going to have the full understanding of all those very technical things like U values, although we can be familiar with them and very comfortable with them, and probably some of the more esoteric listed building stuff is, you know, it's sort of not so easy to learn. So if we, you know, if we can meet in the middle and have that conversation where we can really, you know, work together to come up with the right solution for that building, I think that's the way forward. And it's definitely for conservation officers about that, get that comfort with, you know, yeah, I think I know enough to be able to handle this, which I think we're moving into that phase now, but it's been in the past. I think there's been less comfort. So yeah, that's one of the positive moves I think that we need to keep encouraging.
Just to add to that, Sarah, I think that's yeah, very much been what we've thought as well. We've just had Nick Heath, who does trainings for the Green Register, has just done quite a lot of training, hasn't he, for quite a large cohort of the conservation team at Bath and North East Somerset, which I think was quite helpful, wasn't it, Alex? I think just to sort of, you know, you've got to cross-fertilise the knowledge almost, don't you? Just to the point where each has a bit of a lens of the other.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's it.
That segues nicely actually into the comment made by Sophie Carbon, which Sophie _ Carbon, I don't believe that's your name. Sophie.
Yeah, so I've worked in conservation building in the past, and I have quite a lot of information. And then the I think level 3 course that is required to be like officially trained for this within retrofit coordination was just awful. It was such a low level of knowledge. The trainer, when he tried to talk around the subject, was actively saying things that were incorrect. Yeah, I mean, that just seems like quite a low level of knowledge. You know, it's all sort of tick box stuff, so that doesn't give me much confidence in the level of knowledge that will be needed by someone that has officially got what you need.
The issue comes from as part of the Lisbon Energy Project, we commissioned some retrofit energy assessments from a very well-known organisation, EcoFurb, and almost every single recommendation we were given was unlawful. So we're talking about taking out single glazed windows, replacing them with new double glazed windows, taking plaster off walls, putting insulation in. It was just a litany of stuff that people would be put in jail for.
Wow.
I don't know how much time there is, but just think, if you're coming from the kind of the mainstream retrofit coordination area, it's a very different mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Having done the DEA course myself, I ended up just having arguments with the person teaching us the whole time, because even the recommendations on an EPC, Energy Performance Certificate, some people might just take that as read as they can and should do that because it comes from a government body. And if it says somebody should be insulating the walls and replacing the windows, then they might just try and go ahead and do that and do it unlawfully.
We could, there's a lot we could say. Well, I've got questions about, do we know of any good courses, but we've got a question from Alison Hare at Uttersford. Alison, are you still here?
Alison's come up with a great point, you know, that she's taken on a listed building or a conservation house and has previous owners in the 80s installed aluminium windows. Anyway, if Alison, if you want to say something, but I do know that Saffron
I am here. Sorry.
Oh, good. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it wasn't really a question. It was just a statement to say I found it really interesting today, and I'm trying to get some new windows in my house, but the existing windows are aluminium, so they're not authentic original wooden windows. So should I be allowed to replace them with something that's energy efficient, or would I have to stick with the single glazed wooden windows that the place services at Essex County Council have said is the only option for listed buildings?
Is Serena Cardozo on this call, the conservation officer for Uttersford? She said she was going to hopefully try and join in. I don't think she is.
She would be the authority on this. I
We'll
mean, it's
send
not
her-
so much a question as a cry from the heart, I'm afraid, and I'm
I
sorry to
know.
hear that. I mean, yeah.
Alison, I do know that Jonathan's team at Saffron Walden Community Energy are having a village day at the beginning of March, so you might want to attend that.
Yes.
But also we'll do our best to make sure that Serena Cardoza gets a recording.
And it's just worth saying that different local authorities have different approaches, and it's obviously that they're right to do so, but it's the problem that we are seen across the country as being inconsistent because we choose to approach things in different ways. And yeah.
Well, that's it, Sarah. And because I have a little bit of a focus on Uttlesford, and Jonathan's here as well, I think there's about 2,500 homes in Uttlesford district alone. 3,500, Jonathan. And if we can start to unlock this on a local level, we can help residents who want to retrofit, but also support local skills and jobs and train on a local level as well, which I personally think is really important.
Also, if I could just say that is actually even in my borough in Kensington, it's only very recently that we were willing to accept double glazing in listed buildings or indeed in conservation areas. And I think we've agonized as a department and just decided that actually that yes, that in some cases there's an obvious difference in appearance, but in many, if you get the decently designed, well constructed double glazing, it's not going to look so different as to be a reason not to allow it. And I think there is an issue of justice there to actually say, well, if you live in a historic building, you're not allowed to have the same levels of thermal comfort as your neighbours. It just doesn't feel right anymore. So I'm hoping that we can it's a change that may come in other places as well.
See, I'd have to say you are far more progressive than most, and you normally find that in terms of conservation officers for different eras, they all have particular opinions on it.
Yeah, of course,
and
it's difficult.
and they have to deal with the bosses and things as well. So
yeah,
I know in Uttlesford, depending obviously where you are in Saffron Walden, but it was probably in the conservation era, you will probably struggle.
That's a shame.
So we've got a couple of hands up, so thanks for that. I just wonder, Nikki Myers from Avesco, you got your hand up. I just wonder if Sarah Grimes has got a point relating to this discussion you just want to make, or is it another point? You got your hand up.
I've got a question for Sarah Buckingham, actually. I'm happy to wait.
Okay, can you wait then? So Nikki, I've just last two questions, I'm afraid, before Liz closes out. But Nikki from Avesco in Lewes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Good. I've not really got a question. It's more kind of explaining the really the first steps we've taken. Sorry, headphones off. The first steps that we've taken with the conservation officer here. We had a season in our energy room climate hub before Christmas with the local climate hub, and the conservation officer came and talked alongside Chris Proctor, who's working in Islington. There's an architect up there on conservation areas. We've then just met with the conservation officer, and I think we're going to work with him. He's very overstretched, isn't that what's happening with lots of people, very understaffed. So we're going to take the approach of signposting rather than kind of getting into actually doing retrofit assessments or anything like that, and kind of work with him. So we are explaining to people, the processes of listed buildings, and then hopefully working with him to be able to, I'm hoping, to put in consent orders and things like that. That is my dream. Jonathan, I'd really like to talk to you more as well about this, and maybe even Sarah. It would be really useful to see how you two are working together.
Great. And Nikki's runs an Energy Champion team in Lewes, which is funded through the Ouse Valley Climate Action Programme, which is a lottery funded project.
Yeah. And also LEAD as well, of course.
Yeah, so that's right. So the thing is that Nikki now has the space and the team to be able to help champions do this in their local communities, which is
A
a
little
great.
bit of time to do this. Yes.
Yeah. So there's never enough time, is there, Nikki? So I'll pass to Sarah Grimes, and we are at 11:30. So
yeah. Just a really quick one, sorry for Sarah, and happy to pick this up offline, but with your Windows order, is that normal double glazing or is it slim profile? I couldn't quite
slim. Yeah, we've specified it should be slim. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
You have like a specification of how slim somewhere, do you? Or
we've got some maximum widths, taking into account that we actually have got some quite massive windows in the borough, but but we've said it should be slimline generally.
Yeah, thank you. That was all I had. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. And sorry, Derek, is it a very quick or is it an observation? I see you got your hand up.
Yes, it's a very quick one, if you can manage it. It was really to add to Tim Beecher's question about finding suitably qualified installers and contractors, particularly in the southeast. How do we know when we found a good one? Because presumably the conservation officers are not allowed to make any recommendations.
Yeah, ask for testimonials, but also connect with groups like Tim Beecher's group, like BESCO or Avesco in Lewis, and see if you can work with your local energy, community energy group. But definitely look for testimonials from them. Speak to people who have worked with them.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Derek, and I'm going to pass on to Liz.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers and to everyone who's joined and for all the questions and observations you've made. This is an area I don't know an awful lot about, and it seems clear to me now that it's quite a fragmented sector with sort of, as we've just been talking about retrofit advice and things, that, it's fragmented. And I'm curious if any of you have any comments you would like to make or feedback to us on what would be subsequent valuable webinars we could offer to you. And also, Ollie and I were talking about calls to action. We're not promising, we're already quite overstretched, but I understand there's been consultations on historic buildings guidance and things like that. But just in terms of this fragmentation, if you have ideas on anything we could be doing to make things a little bit clearer for people, do please let us know. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And we will send out the recording and presentations in the next couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we can stop recording now.